Charles C.W. Cooke, National Review, got the cover story on Sheriff David Clarke up in Milwaukee. Charles, good morning to you.
Good morning. How are you?
We're doing very well. How's everything going this morning?
Very well. I'm in the fair city of Washington, D.C. today.
We were there a couple of weeks ago. We just caught the end of the cherry blossom, so I imagine by this point they're long gone.
I think so. I think all virtue has gone from this city a long time ago.
You're still continuing, I know, on the book tour as well for the Conservatarian Manifesto. All seems to have been well received from many quarters, correct?
I've been pleased, I have to say. It hasn't set off too many internecine fights between conservatives and libertarians. In fact, it seems to have been reasonably attractive to both sides beyond the hardcore types. So it's been refreshing.
Cover story this fortnight, I guess. It's every 2-week publication. National Review, the Sheriff as Rebel, talking about David A. Clarke, the Sheriff of Milwaukee County. And boy, if you weren't familiar with him before what's been happening in Baltimore the past few days, you probably are now, because he has been all over the place and has become a bigger media celebrity here over the past at least year or so. But even going back, you mentioned the ad from January 2013, which first got people's attention. Mayor Bloomberg getting into his race with 6 figures also got people's attention too. What is it that drew you to David Clarke, Sheriff Clarke, and what did you find out?
Well, I think whether you agree with David Clarke or not, and I am a mixture of the two. There are many issues on which I disagree with him and many on which I agree with him. But I think regardless of your position, he is undoubtedly an interesting character. There are 2 real components to that. The first is how quickly he rose to prominence. He, 2 or 3, 4 years ago, was relatively unknown, despite having been the mayor of, the sheriff. Getting ahead of myself is perhaps the next step. The sheriff of Milwaukee County for, I think, since 2002. And he rose to prominence. He put out this advertisement saying, look, we've had budget cuts. We can't be everywhere at once. The police are there as a supplement, but they can't guarantee your security. Perhaps you should familiarize yourself with how firearms work. And, of course, this set off a firestorm. As you said, Bloomberg got involved. I think that's an interesting story. I think that to go from relative obscurity to being a darling of the National Rifle Association, to being a regular on Fox, to being a spokesman for police, to being a national figure, in short. I saw the reception that he got not just at the NRA convention, but in Wisconsin in conservative circles. It's fascinating. And his electoral coalition has changed too. He is elected now by a combination of black voters and white conservative voters. There are very few people in the country who can say that. And the second part of it is just that he is unorthodox. It's not just the clothes, it's not just the horse, it's not just the hat. He is a black Democrat who is scathing about his own party, who is harsh about young black men in the way that, say, Bill Cosby was, who is in favor of the private ownership of firearms, and not just because he thinks that there's a practical case for it, but because he understands how the black tradition of arms and the Second Amendment relate.
You would think a guy like the sheriff here would draw a certain amount of ire, and he certainly has. You Google him and grab some of the things that have been written about him. But boy, the acrimony that goes on between him and the city is pretty amazing.
That's right, and that's the word he used when I asked him to describe his relationship with the city. He said it was acrimonious, and it will be. The mayor of Milwaukee, Tom Barrett, is a straight-down-the-line progressive. He is orthodox in his progressivism, and as far as David Clarke is concerned, that progressivism has failed. I went out into what is impolitely called the ghetto, which is politely called the central city. I put on a bulletproof vest, and we drove around, walked around for an hour and a half. And it is apocalyptic. Many of the houses are boarded up and abandoned. Those that are not are mostly in disrepair. People have just left cars, sometimes vintage cars there. There's trash all throughout the streets. Most of the people on the streets are shiftless, out of work, run away when they see a police car. It is not what I would call a success story. Now, we can argue all day as to what caused that, and indeed we're having a similar conversation now over Baltimore. But if you have the views that Sheriff Clarke has, you are going to disagree with the Tom Barretts of the world pretty strongly. And by all accounts, it's not just that Barrett is not a great fan of the police. It's not just that they disagree over budgetary matters. It's that they have fundamentally different ways of seeing the problems that face them. And that's going to be tough.
Charles C.W. Cooke with us from National Review, nationalreview.com, or the print edition, the cover story, The Sheriff as Rebel, talking about Sheriff David Clarke of Milwaukee County. You spent some time with him, obviously, one-on-one, and this question always pops up, I think, when someone experiences a great amount of media attention in a very short amount of time. Is there any indication or any feeling on your part that he is not genuine in any way, that some of this is for self-promotion or for attention?
No, I think he's genuine. I think he was genuinely surprised by it at first. We all enjoy attention, and I'm sure that he has now become accustomed to cultivating his position, especially if your role is largely ceremonial, is largely a leadership role, a public role.
Mm-hmm.
And of course you're going to enjoy being on television. From what I understand, and of course I never know what is going on in another person's heart, but from what I understand, Sheriff Clarke had broadly the same conversion on the question of firearms in the history of the Second Amendment that I did. Not specifically on the practical side. I never thought, for example, I needed a gun where I live, but having read about the changes that occurred within the black community, within the prospects for black liberty, after the 14th Amendment was passed, after black Americans were able to defend themselves from what in some cases was essentially state-sponsored terrorism under the KKK. You read Ida B. Wells and it's harrowing on this question. He understands how important that is, and I do too. And that's one of the reasons, of course, that I wanted to interview him. So no, I don't think he's faking it.
You said that there are certain things, and you allude to it in the article as well, things that you find yourself in disagreement with the sheriff. What would a couple of those things be?
Well, I think he makes a very good point about the genesis of the drug war, but I disagree with his conclusions. What he says is that during the 1980s, when the crack epidemic hit, and when the attendant violence started to plague black communities, black mayors and politicians started to plead with Congress to pass stricter sentencing guidelines, to give them tools to deal with drug dealers, those who were supplying the crack. That was a great blight in that era. And now it's presumed that the drug war was passed by racist white people to incarcerate young black men. I think he makes a reasonable case that that's not true. Where we disagree is that I think the drug war has been almost a holistic disaster. I think the whole kit and caboodle is doing more harm than good. And he doesn't. He sees, in fact, the drug war as liberating good, poor black people within Milwaukee. So he and I have a disagreement there. And I think he's more defensive of the police reflexively than I am. Mm-hmm. That's perhaps to be expected. He is in that business. So no, he and I disagree on a great deal, and he is harsh with his language in the way that I would be. He said that blacks demonstrate an abject civility to the Democratic Party. It is towards the plantation rhetoric that I dislike. But generally speaking, I think he's an admirable man. I think he's sincere, and I think he's a great role model for everybody. He's often held up as the role model for black people. That's nonsense. We look at people for their character, not the color of their skin. He's clearly worth emulating.
Charles C.W. Cooke with us from National Review, nationalreview.com, and the cover story, The Sheriff as Rebel. It's Riley and Scot on WROK. There's a beef right now between Milwaukee Mayor Tom Barrett and Governor Scott Walker, and Barrett says Walker's to blame for the increase in crime in the city of Milwaukee. Certainly, Sheriff Clarke is in charge of Milwaukee County, but the city of Milwaukee has its own police department, so there are mitigating factors here. But the question I'm getting to is there evidence that Clarke has been successful in his job as sheriff? Meaning, is the area safer? Have things improved for the residents of Milwaukee County from a public safety perspective since he's been in office?
Well, regardless of the relative improvement or deterioration, it is worth saying that Milwaukee is something of a disaster. It is bleeding residents. Its crime rate, I think it's the fourth highest crime rate per 100,000 in the United States. Mm-hmm. It is lacking in jobs and infrastructure. Now, in evaluating whose fault that is, we go back to basic fault lines within our politics, which is to say that obviously as a conservative, a libertarian conservative, I look at a place like Milwaukee and I say, well, of course David Clarke can't do too much, mm-hmm. Because the city is structurally run by people who dislike him, who control his budget, and who advocate and put into place policies that destroy cities, communities, and ultimately the country. I, of course, have my critics who will then say, well, no, it's Republicans' fault. But I do think, and I must say this, I do think that it is a little bit cheap for the left to point to cities like Baltimore and Philadelphia and Milwaukee and say, well, it's conservatives' fault, or that the one or two conservatives that are running around the place are somehow to blame. Now, these cities have been run by progressive Democrats now for years. I think Baltimore last had a Republican mayor in 1963. As I said, Tom Barrett in Milwaukee has been there since 2002. They have a clear job to do, and I don't think they're doing it. And when you have a figure such as David Clarke, who says, look, I'm tearing my hair out, I can't protect everybody at all times, go and buy a gun, you can see how difficult the situation in which he's operating is.
He's Charles C.W. Cooke. If you're not reading his stuff, you are missing out. Grab the National Review, read the cover story on Sheriff Clarke, and then go back and read all the other things that he's written as well, and grab his book, too. Charles, as always, we appreciate you taking time out of your morning for us.
Thank you so much for having me.